Owning a farm should be simple. You plant, you harvest, you take care of your animals, and you live your life. But when your farm is right next to an HOA neighborhood, suddenly it becomes a battleground. I never expected to spend my days defending my land from a woman who thought she ruled over everything in sight. But that's exactly what happened. Karen. If you've ever had the misfortune of dealing with an HOA nightmare, multiply it by 10, and you'd have this woman. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was a self-appointed dictator who treated every blade of grass in her neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom. The problem? My farm wasn't part of her HOA, but that didn't stop her from trying to control it. The day I moved in, she marched right up my driveway with a clipboard in hand and an attitude like she was inspecting a crime scene. "You're the new owner?" she asked, looking me up and down like I was a stain on her perfectly beige world. I nodded. "Yup. This farm's been in my family for generations." Karen pursed her lips. "Well, we have standards here, and I'll have you know that the neighborhood has expectations. We take pride in keeping our community orderly and presentable." I glanced around. My barn stood proudly, painted red just like my grandfather had left it. The fields were neat, the fences sturdy, and my animals, well, they were animals. This wasn't some perfectly curated suburban cul-de-sac. This was a farm, a real working farm. I shrugged. "Sounds great, but I'm not part of your HOA." Karen's eye twitched. "That may be the case technically, but this is still a neighborhood, and we must maintain a certain aesthetic. I assume you'll be making some adjustments." I had no idea what she was talking about, but I already knew one thing. This woman was going to be a problem. Turns out that was an understatement. She wasn't just a problem. She was a full-scale disaster. At first, it was little things. A note left on my gate about how my fencing was an eyesore. A complaint that my barn was too bright and should be painted a neutral color to blend in. A warning that my rooster, who was far away from any houses, was disrupting the peaceful mornings of the neighborhood. I ignored her. That's when she escalated. She sent out a newsletter to the entire neighborhood, specifically targeting my farm. She called it a growing concern and listed out all the ways my land was ruining their property values. Apparently, the smell of fresh soil was offensive. The sound of my animals existing was too disruptive. And the sight of farm equipment was unsightly. Keep in mind, my farm had been there for generations. Her HOA neighborhood was built next to me, not the other way around. But in Karen's mind, I was the one invading her space. She knocked on my door one morning with a petition in hand, her face set in a smug smile. "We've gathered signatures," she said, holding the paper out like it was a legal document. "The neighborhood has spoken. We'd like you to remove the livestock." I stared at her. "You want me to what?" She nodded like she was being reasonable. "Chickens, goats, cattle, this isn't a barnyard. We'd appreciate if you transitioned to something more appropriate." I laughed. "You realize this is a farm, right? Like an actual farm." Karen didn't laugh. "We'll be speaking with the city if you refuse to cooperate." And just like that, it wasn't just petty HOA drama anymore. It was a full-blown war. The city officials knew better. I had every permit, every zoning approval, and every legal right to operate my farm. But that didn't stop Karen from finding new ways to harass me. She called code enforcement for unpermitted structures on my land. They showed up, checked my property, and left without a problem. She reported my fences for being too high and blocking the view. The city checked. Everything was legal. She even went as far as to call animal control on my livestock. And when they arrived, they found healthy, well-cared-for animals with no violations whatsoever. Karen was furious. She started lurking at the edge of my property, snapping pictures. She even tried talking to my farmhands, telling them they weren't allowed to park their trucks near the road. Every single time I shut her down. But she wasn't done. When harassment didn't work, she went for the nuclear option. She called 911. One afternoon, as I was working in the barn, I heard the distant sound of sirens. At first I figured it was just a patrol car passing by. But then I saw them, 2 police cruisers pulling into my driveway, and standing right behind them, Karen, arms crossed, lips curled into that smug, self-satisfied grin. She had called the cops on my farm, and she thought she had finally won. What she didn't know was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, because the police weren't the only ones on their way. A black government vehicle rolled up right behind them, and that's when things took a turn she never saw coming. The police cars came to a slow stop in my driveway, their lights flashing but sirens silent. I wiped the dirt off my hands on my jeans, already knowing who was behind this. Karen stood just behind the officers, arms crossed, an arrogant smirk on her face. She knew she had won this time. As the officers stepped out, she wasted no time. "There," she said, pointing at me like she was calling out a criminal in a police lineup. "That man is operating an illegal commercial business on residential land. He's in clear violation of zoning laws, and I demand action." The taller officer raised an eyebrow and turned toward me. "Sir, we received a complaint about unauthorized livestock and zoning violations. Are you the owner of this property?" I nodded. "That's right. This farm has been in my family for generations." Karen let out a fake laugh. "Oh, I'm sure it has, but that doesn't change the fact that he's running a business here. That barn isn't just for storage. He's selling produce, eggs, dairy. He's turned this into a commercial operation in a residential zone. I have proof." She held up a thick stack of printed-out documents, as if she had just uncovered the crime of the century. The officer took the papers and started flipping through them. I could already tell by the way his expression didn't change that he wasn't impressed. "Selling at a farmer's market doesn't make this a commercial property, ma'am," the officer said. "This is a farm." Karen's smirk faltered. She wasn't done yet. "How about the trucks, the farm equipment? I have pictures of multiple work vehicles entering and leaving the property. That's business activity, isn't it?" I sighed, crossing my arms. "Karen, those are supply deliveries. Farms need equipment and materials. You do realize that food doesn't just appear on store shelves by magic, right?" Karen's face turned red, but she wasn't about to let go of her fantasy victory. "That's beside the point. This place is ruining our neighborhood. The smell, the noise, the—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing. Another vehicle had just pulled up. But it wasn't another police car. A black SUV with tinted windows rolled to a stop behind the cruisers. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a dark suit holding a briefcase. He walked with the kind of authority that made everyone go silent. Karen frowned. Who is that?" I smiled. "Oh, Karen, I think you're about to find out." The man in the suit didn't look at Karen. He walked straight toward the officers and nodded. "Morning, gentlemen. I was asked to come down here for a site visit." Karen looked between me, the officers, and the new arrival. Her confusion was turning into something else. Nervousness. "Excuse me, who are you?" she demanded, her voice shrill. The man turned toward her, his face unreadable. "I work with the State Agricultural Protection Bureau. We received a report that someone was interfering with a legally protected farm." Karen visibly flinched. The smugness was gone. Wait, what? That's not what this is about. I called the police because he's violating zoning laws and—" The man in the suit ignored her. He turned back to me. "Mr. Carter, you're the owner of this property, correct?" I nodded. "That's right." "And you are operating under a legal agricultural exemption, as outlined in state law?" I smiled. You bet. The man flipped open his briefcase, pulled out a folder, and looked back at Karen. Mum, are you aware that this farm is protected under the Right to Farm Act? Karen blinked. The what? The Right to Farm Act, the man repeated. A state law that prevents neighborhoods, HOAs, and local ordinances from interfering with legally recognized farms. That includes noise complaints, aesthetic disputes, and… He glanced at her documents. Attempts to reclassify farms as commercial businesses simply because they sell agricultural goods. Karen's jaw dropped open. The police officer, the one holding her stack of so-called evidence, let out a low sigh and handed the papers over to the man in the suit. Mr. Leland, this is Mrs. Davis. She's the one who made the complaint. Mr. Leland flipped through the documents, not even looking up at her. Then he closed the folder. Mum, he said flatly, this isn't just legally protected farmland. This land was established before your neighborhood was even built, meaning it has more standing here than your HOA does. If looks could kill, Karen would have buried me on the spot. That's ridiculous. This is a residential community. We didn't move here to live next to a… Mom, Leland interrupted. This farm has been here for over 100 years. The HOA was formed much later. If your association didn't want to be next to farmland, it should have done better research before expanding into agricultural land. You could have heard a pin drop. Karen was fuming. But that's not fair. This farm is ruining our property values. We have standards. Leland sighed, rubbing his temples. And Mr. Carter has rights, legally protected ones. By filing multiple false complaints, you are actively harassing a legally recognized farm. Karen's hands balled into fists. That's insane. I have had to put up with this for years. The smell, the noise, the mess. It's time for this farm to go. Leland raised an eyebrow. Miss Davis, filing repeated false complaints against a protected agricultural property is a direct violation of state law. Additionally, any further attempts to interfere with this farm could result in civil penalties and legal action. Karen actually gasped. Legal action? Leland nodded once. Yes, that means fines, lawsuits, and potential liability for any financial damages Mr. Carter has suffered due to these continued false complaints. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Karen, however, was losing it. You can't do this. This is corruption. This is government overreach. He bribed you, didn't he? Leland sighed. He turned toward the police. Officers, I believe we're done here. I'll be filing a formal complaint against Mrs. Davis for repeated malicious legal actions against this farm. The Department of Agriculture will be in touch. The lead officer turned toward Karen, clearly fed up. Mum, at this point, we're going to strongly advise that you stop interfering with this property. Continuing down this path could lead to legal consequences. Karen looked like she was about to explode. You can't be serious. Very serious, Leland said, closing his briefcase. And if you continue harassing Mr. Carter, we will escalate this matter. Karen let out an incoherent screech, throwing one last wild glare at me before storming back toward her house. Leland shook his head. People like that never learn. I chuckled. Never. But as I watched Karen stomp up her driveway, one thought crossed my mind. This might be over for now, but knowing her, she wasn't done yet. Karen stood there, frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had called the police. She had made the complaint. She had done her research and was supposed to be the one winning right now. Instead, she was standing in the middle of my farm, getting lectured by a government official about how she was the one breaking the law. Her hands clenched into fists. This is insane. You're telling me that I have to just sit here and accept that this This filthy barnyard is ruining our neighborhood. You can't be serious." Mr. Leland remained completely unfazed. He calmly flipped open his briefcase again and pulled out a small, official-looking booklet. "Miss Davis, this is the Right to Farm Act," he said, holding it up. "A legally binding document that protects established farms like Mr. Carter's from unlawful interference. I suggest you take a moment to educate yourself." Karen didn't even look at the booklet. "I don't care what some ancient law says. This is 2025. People don't move into suburban communities to live next to a bunch of noisy, stinking animals. We have rights too." Leland didn't react. Instead, he calmly flipped open the booklet, found the page he was looking for, and pointed at it. "This section right here explicitly states that any individual or entity that knowingly obstructs, disrupts, or harasses a legally recognized farm can face civil penalties, and in cases where damages are proven, criminal charges." Karen stumbled back a step, like he had just slapped her across the face. "Criminal charges?" she choked out. One of the police officers, the one who had been quiet up until now, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Ma'am, you've filed multiple false reports against this farm, attempted to manipulate zoning laws under fraudulent pretenses, and have repeatedly interfered with a protected agricultural operation." He crossed his arms. "That's more than enough grounds for an official investigation." Karen's face turned white. She whipped around toward the crowd of neighbors who had gathered at the edge of my property. "You all saw this, right? You're just going to stand there and let him get away with ruining our community?" The crowd had been silent for most of this, watching the spectacle unfold. But at her desperate plea, they began glancing at each other uncomfortably. And that's when it happened. The moment Karen lost everything. The first to speak was Mr. Reynolds, a long-time resident in the neighborhood. He crossed his arms and let out a deep sigh. "Karen," he said, his voice carrying a tone of exhausted frustration, "you've gone too far." Karen's head snapped toward him so fast it was a miracle she didn't break her neck. "Excuse me?" Reynolds shook his head. "This farm has been here longer than all of us. You knew that when you moved in. And let's be honest, you've been harassing this man for years. You call the cops over everything. You demand ridiculous changes. And now you're filing fraudulent complaints?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Other neighbors were nodding along. Mrs. Carter, a woman who had once been on Karen's side, now crossed her arms and frowned. "We moved here for peace, Karen. But ever since you took over the HOA, all you do is start problems. You fine people for leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes late. You threaten to tow cars that are legally parked, and now this." Karen looked genuinely betrayed. You don't understand," she stammered, voice shaking. "I was trying to protect property values. Property values?" Mr. Reynolds let out a dry laugh. "Karen, my home's value has actually gone down since you started running this HOA like a dictatorship." Karen visibly flinched, but the final blow came when another police car rolled into the driveway. This one was different. A young officer stepped out, holding a clipboard, and walked over to the group. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, glancing at his notes, "but we just got confirmation from the county clerk's office. They flagged some irregularities in the HOA's financial filings. We need to bring in a Mrs. Davis for questioning." Karen's face drained of color. "What?" she whispered. The senior officer sighed. "Miss Davis, we're going to need you to come with us." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, her silence exploded into pure, uncontrolled rage. "What? No! This is a mistake! You should be arresting him!" She pointed wildly at me, shaking with fury. Nobody reacted. The police officers didn't even blink. One of them stepped forward, handcuffs at the ready. "Ma'am, Please don't make this any harder than it needs to be. Karen shoved the clipboard away and tried to backpedal toward her house. No, you can't do this. I'm the HOA president. Not anymore. The voice was Mr. Reynolds. Karen froze. We're having an emergency HOA meeting tonight. His voice was calm but final. You're officially being voted out. Karen's entire body stiffened. And then finally the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. You ruined everything! She screeched at me as the officers led her toward the cruiser. I smiled. No, Karen, I said, tilting my head. You did that all by yourself. As the police cars rolled away, a slow clap started among the neighbors. Mr. Reynolds turned to me and let out a long breath. Guess she finally pushed too far. I nodded, shaking my head. Guess so. Leland chuckled. Sometimes people bury themselves. You just have to stand back and let them dig. Karen was gone. The HOA was under official scrutiny. And my farm? Completely safe. For the first time in years, I felt free. The last thing I saw before the police car pulled away was Karen's face, twisted in absolute rage. Her mouth was moving, screaming something, but the officers had already shut the door. The neighbors, once her loyal followers, stood in stunned silence. Some still processing what had just happened. Others, well, they were relieved. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was quiet. No more clipboard-checking dictator hovering around people's lawns. No more absurd fines. No more constant harassment. Karen was gone, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Because people like Karen, they don't just disappear. As the police cruisers drove off, a murmur rippled through the crowd. People started talking, some whispering, some shaking their heads, some laughing nervously like they couldn't believe what had just happened. Then someone clapped. It started slow. One person, then another. And before I knew it, a small wave of applause broke out among the neighbors. It wasn't a full-on celebration, not yet. But it was the sound of people letting out a breath they had been holding for too long. Mr. Reynolds turned to me, crossing his arms. Well, didn't expect that to happen today. I chuckled, shaking my head. Yeah, neither did I. Mrs. Carter sighed, rubbing her forehead. You know, I never really liked her, but I thought she had some good intentions at first. Then she just got worse. You mean drunk on power? Reynolds corrected. She nodded. Yeah, that. The neighbors started milling around, talking about next steps. Who would take over the HOA? Would things finally go back to normal? That's when one guy, someone I didn't know that well, spoke up. Hey, he said, pointing a thumb over his shoulder. You know her husband left town last week, right? I blinked. Wait, what? Another neighbor nodded. Yeah, moved out. Karen told people he had business to take care of, but I heard from someone else that he just packed up and left. Now that was interesting, because if there was one person in the world I would have expected to back Karen up, it was her husband. Yet, here she was, going down in flames alone. That explained a lot. No wonder she had been more desperate than usual. She wasn't just losing control over the neighborhood. She was losing everything. I finally made my way back to my farmhouse, letting the neighbors talk amongst themselves. My farmhands had been watching from a distance, but now they got back to work. As I stepped inside, I let out a long exhale. For the first time in years, I could finally relax. No more surprise complaints. No more zoning nonsense. No more cops showing up because Karen was having a tantrum. I could finally breathe, and yet, something still nagged at me. Karen had spent years harassing me. She had dedicated herself to trying to destroy my farm. Could she really be done that easily? I glanced at my phone. A message from my lawyer. Call me when you get a chance. There's something you should know. Great. That didn't sound good. I dialed him back immediately. He answered on the first ring. I assume you've heard? He said. I frowned. Heard what? A pause. Then, Karen posted bail. My stomach dropped. She's already out? Yeah. And she's mad. Of course she was. Of course she wasn't just going to go away quietly. She lawyered up, my attorney continued, and I've already been contacted about some, let's call them pending legal matters. I pinched the bridge of my nose. She's suing me, isn't she? Well, technically she's threatening to. Nothing filed yet. But she's claiming she's been unfairly targeted, defamed, and, get this, unlawfully removed from her position of power. I actually laughed. Unlawfully removed? It was an HOA vote. Yep, he said. She doesn't care. She's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. Honestly, I don't think she has a case. But knowing Karen, she won't care about the legal side of it. She just wants to make your life miserable. That part I believed. Karen didn't care about winning. She cared about revenge. So what do I do? I asked. For now, he said. Nothing. Let her blow off steam. If she actually files something, we'll deal with it. Until then, don't engage. Easier said than done, I muttered. He chuckled. Oh, I'm sure. But just sit tight. She'll slip up. People like her always do. For the next week, things were eerily quiet. Too quiet. Karen hadn't shown her face. No sudden police visits. No random zoning complaints. Then, a letter arrived. Official looking. From a law firm. I opened it up, skimming the contents. And then I laughed. Karen wasn't suing me. She was suing the entire HOA. And not just for removing her. She was suing for damages. She wanted money for all the stress they had caused her. She wanted them to reinstate her position. She even demanded a public apology for wrongfully tarnishing her reputation. I almost wished I could see the looks on the neighbors' faces when they read this. Karen, after spending years controlling every aspect of their lives, after making their lives miserable, was now trying to squeeze money out of them. It was so incredibly on brand for her that I couldn't help but admire the sheer delusion. I didn't even have to do anything. The HOA board, now under new leadership, immediately lawyered up, and within 48 hours, they sent Karen a counter notice. Their message was simple: drop the lawsuit, or we'll file our own. That's when Karen finally disappeared for good. No more lawsuits. No more complaints. No more Karen. The house she had fought so hard to protect. Sold within a month. She packed up, left town, and never looked back. And my farm? Still standing. Still thriving. And for the first time in years, completely Karen-free.